Good morning to everyone. We're going to go to 1 Samuel, 1 Samuel, chapter 18, 1 Samuel 18. Patricio, this was the favorite hymn of my grandfather. My grandfather sang that hymn all the time, and we even sang it at his funeral. I think that's the first time that I've heard it in Spanish. It's a great blessing. Thank you for guiding us. So, camp is only 2 months away. So that means that my study has been immersed completely in this year's theme, the life of David. This is a special season for Jessica and for me. The very first year that we served as counselors, the theme was David. I even had the high privilege of portraying David in the big event. We repeat these themes about every decade. So here we are, 10 years later, coming back to the son of Jesse. And as I've been preparing, I've tried to look at David with fresh eyes. Some of our campers come with a deep foundation of biblical knowledge. But for others, the names of Moses, Paul, and David are brand new. It's a challenge to see this story as if it were for the first time, because the narrative of David gives us some of the most famous stories in human history. So let me ask you, what event or season of David's life formed him more than any other? It's an easy question, right? When we think of the righteous king of Israel, we all think of the same foundational story. Say it with me. David and everybody, all my children said the same thing. It's David and Goliath. It is the quintessential story of the underdog, the shepherd boy with a sling against the giant with a spear. But here is what is interesting. We get to know David through two different lenses. Two different lenses. We have the narrative first about him in 1 and 2 Samuel. And we have the writings from him in the Psalms. David wrote at least half of the Psalms, most likely 73 of the 150. If the battle with Goliath was truly the defining formative peak of his life, we would surely expect a good number of those 73 Psalms to be filled with David's recollections of that day in the valley of Elah. We would expect verses about smooth stones, the weight of Saul's armor, and the roar of the Philistine. Yet, how many of David's Psalms are about that esteemed battle with a giant? The number is exactly zero. Zero. We consider Psalm 144 as an allusion to it, where he speaks of God training his fingers for battle. But Goliath never serves as a major theme in David's own poetry. So it got me curious. If Goliath didn't define David's spiritual vocabulary, what did? As revealed through the Psalms, which season shaped his conception of God more than any other? My reading has yielded a clear but unexpected answer. To find it, we have to look past the victory at Elah. Let's start this morning in 1 Samuel 18. David has just returned from the battlefield. He's a national hero. The women are singing in the streets. Saul, verse 7. Saul has struck down his thousands, and David his 10,000s. But notice the immediate shift in the atmosphere. Verse 9 tells us, and Saul eyed David from that day on. What follows is a season of life that David never expected. We often think that once God anoints you, it's a straight line to the throne. For David, the line went through the furnace of jealousy. In 1 Samuel 18, Saul's envy turns violent. While David is playing the lyre, literally serving the king's peace, Saul tries to pin him to the wall with a spear. Not once, but twice. Think of the confusion that David must have felt. He had been faithful. He had been brave. And yet he is met with an irrational, burning enmity. Saul offered him his daughter Merab, then gives her to another. He offers his daughter Michal, but only as a snare to get David killed by the Philistines. David wins that battle too, but the victory only makes Saul more afraid. 1 Samuel 19 tells us Saul finally commands his son Jonathan and all his servants to kill David. David becomes a fugitive in his own land. He flees to Ramah to be with Samuel. But Saul's messengers follow. He meets Jonathan in a field, realizing that the palace life is now over. He is now a man of the field again, but this time he isn't watching sheep. He is being hunted like one of them. In chapter 21 of 1 Samuel, he flees to the priest at Nob, desperate and hungry, eating the holy showbread just to survive. Then, in a moment of utter desperation, he flees to Gath, the hometown of Goliath. Imagine the irony. The giant killer seeking refuge in the giant's backyard. The very sword he used to behead Goliath is now strapped to his hip as he drools on the gates of Goliath's kin. He has been stripped of everything but the weapon that reminds him how far he has fallen from the cheers of the women in the streets. He has to feign insanity just to convince the Philistines that he isn't a threat. David has been dismantled. He has lost his wife, his best friend, his mentor, his home, and truly his dignity. He's burnt all his bridges. And this leads us to the climax of the transition in 1 Samuel 22, verse 1. David departed from there and escaped to the cave of Adullam. Once again, verse 1. David departed from there and escaped to the cave of Adullam. We need to slow down and soak in this moment. David is alone. He's in a hole in the ground. These caves are not pleasant. They're damp, dark, and silent. But then verse 2 happens. And everyone who was in distress and everyone who was in debt and everyone who was bitter in soul gathered to him, and he became commander over them. And there were with him about 400 men. This is the birth. This is the birth of the true Davidic kingdom. It doesn't start in a coronation hall. It starts in a cave. David is the anointed king, yet his subjects are the outcasts, the dead-ridden, the anxious, the broken-hearted. They all look at the man in the cave and say, he is our leader. But the tragedy doesn't stop at the cave door. David isn't just hiding from Saul. He is hiding with the blood of 85 priests on his conscience because Saul massacred them at Nob for helping David. David carries that guilt into the darkness with him. In chapter 23, David saves the city of Keilah from the Philistines, acting as the true king of the people. But the people he saved prepare to hand him over to Saul. David is learning a hard lesson. Your success does not guarantee your safety, and your service does not guarantee your reputation. He flees to the wilderness of Ziph, hiding in the woods, and then to the wilderness of Maon. Every time he thinks he has found a place to rest, the reports come in. Saul is coming. This cycle of pursuit and narrow escape culminates in the dramatic tension of 1 Samuel 23, 25 to 28. Text says that Saul and his men went to seek him, and David went down to the rock. Listen, verse 25. And Saul went on one side of the mountain, and David and his men on the other side of the mountain. And David was hurrying to get away from Saul. As Saul and his men were closing in on David and his men to capture them, the circle is closing. The trap is shut. David is out of options and out of room. But at that exact moment, the providence of God breaks in. A messenger came to Saul saying, "Hurry and come, for the Philistines have made a raid against the land." So Saul returned from pursuing after David. The Bible says they call the place in Hebrew Selah Hamalekot. That means the rock of escape. In the very moment where David was most vulnerable, he found that his hard place was actually the place where God would divide him from his enemy. Which is a better story to tell at camp? At camp. A boy killing a giant with a rock, or a weary man hiding in a cave for 10 years. We love the 3-minute victory, but we aren't as quick to tell our kids about the 3,650 days. Once again, the 3,650 days that David spent on the run. Based on the biblical timeline, David spent roughly 1/3 of his life as a fugitive. For 10 years, David's office was a cave. His bed was a stone. His companions were debtors. We see Goliath as the definition of David, but David saw this decade as a definition of his God. As we know that because of the headers of our Psalms. See with me Psalm 57. Psalm 57. Make sure if you look at the heading, a Miktam of David. When he fled from Saul in the cave. Another one, Psalm 142. a maskil of David, when a prayer which he had when he was in the cave. One more, Psalm 34, of Psalm of David, when he changed his behavior before Abimelech. This season. This season formed the vocabulary of David's faith. He stopped talking about shepherds and started talking about stone. Look at Psalm 62 with me. Psalm 62. For God alone, my soul waits in silence. He alone is my rock and my salvation. David learned that God was not just a helper, he was, in Hebrew, a Selah, a high, craggy, inaccessible cliff that the spears of man could not reach. Consider the victory song of David's life. It's so important that God put it in the Bible twice. Here in Psalm, it must be the most important Psalm of the Bible. You see it once in Psalm 18, and if we go to Samuel 22, to Samuel 22, notice where it is placed in 2 Samuel. It appears at the very end of the book as as David looks back over his entire life. This is a structural bookend. Hear how it begins. The Lord is my rock and my fortress and my deliverer, my God, my rock, in whom I take refuge. In my distress, I call upon the Lord. To my God I called. From his temple he heard my voice, and my cry came to his ears. David isn't using a metaphor he read in a book. He's looking back at the rock of escape and realizing that God never stopped being that rock. The hard place of the wilderness became the firm place of his entire life's theology. But this isn't just a biography of David, because 1 Samuel 20, 1 Samuel 22, verse 2, is a shout out to who? To who? Jesus. The world expects a king to sit in a palace and gather the best and the brightest. But when God promised that a son of David would sit on the throne, he was not promising a king who would be immune. He was promising a king who would rule from the cave. Jesus Christ is the true David. When he began his ministry, where did he go? To the wilderness, Matthew 4. He spent 40 days being hunted by the enemy. When he preached the gospel, who gathered to him? It was the distressed, the indebted, and the bitter in soul. Jesus said, "The Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head." Matthew 8:20. Jesus lived the Adulam life. He was a king in exile. Notice the beauty of the rock imagery. In 1 Corinthians 10:4, Paul says that the spiritual rock that followed Israel was Christ. But remember what had to happen to that rock? It had to be struck. Our king was struck. He was rejected, stripped, and cleft on the cross. And why was he struck? Because living water flows to us misfits. The cave of Adullam is a picture of the church, a gathering of debtors who have found a king who has paid their debt. Jesus is the king in the cave who stands with us when the winters of life seem like they will never end. So, what does that mean for us? First, we must settle the question of our identity. We often want to present ourselves as mighty men before being misfits. We want to get to the palace with our polished resumes, but 1 Samuel 22 tells us that the only requirement for entry was to be in distress, in debt, or bitter in soul. If you feel like a misfit this morning, you are in the exact right place. David's cave was the only place in Israel where the law of Saul couldn't reach you. We are the debtors who have come to the king who paid the debt. Stop trying to be mighty and courageous on your own and start being a participant in the grace of the king. Second, we must adjust our theology. We think often that following God means standing over giants every single day. But David teaches us that God, saying, "God is my rock," not as a slogan, it's a recognition of his steadfast love and mercy amidst the trial. To call God a rock implies that there is a storm. In Psalm 62, Saul is still out there. Peace comes from the nature of the rock. Our theology must be big enough to handle the 10-year wait. He is not a God of rescue, but of redemption. Finally, let us consider our worship. One of Eric's sermons gave me this idea. Ultimately, the cave is not meant to be the destination. The cave is meant to bring us to the tent, the tabernacle, to the presence of God. If you look at Psalm 61, verses 2 and 4, Psalm 61, verse 2 and 4. Lead me to the rock that is higher than I. Let me dwell in your tent forever. This desire for the tent defines David's heart. In Amos 9, don't go there, but just listen. Amos 9, God promises to restore the fallen tent of David. Unlike a rigid palace, the tent represents intimate worship, constant and intimate worship. David learned to thirst in the cave so he would know how to drink in the tent in the trials. Don't only pray for the cave to end, pray for the rock to take you for redemption. The cave is where we find our protection, but the tent, the tabernacle, is where we find our purpose. It is where the misfits are transformed into a priesthood. And it is in the echoes of the cave that David found his song. It's in our hard places that we find ours. In a few weeks, some of us will be at camp. We're going to tell kids that they don't have to be giants to be loved. They just have to be thirsty. We serve a king who was rejected so that we could be accepted. We serve a king who walked, who not only saw our trials from far away, but he found the cave of the grave and conquered it from the inside out. In the resurrection, Jesus has come victorious from the cave. Amen. Patricio, if you please, get ready. Jesus has demonstrated that the hard place of death could not only hold the life of the world. If you're wandering in the wilderness this morning, stop running away from the rock and start running towards it. The king has emerged and he has prepared plenty of room for you in his eternal kingdom. Run to the rock this morning as we stand up and as we sing.